Hello, and thank you for joining us on Searching for Answers. We're still in the book of John. It has so many beautiful things. We just can't hurry up and get out. So bear with us. Get your Bibles and turn to John chapter 13. I believe it's the 20th verse. 21st verse. Ivan, would you start reading for me, please?
Okay. After saying this, Jesus was troubled. Now he said, whoever receives me has received the Father. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter, therefore, motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him.
Isn't that something?
It's a strong
statement. I forgot to have you introduce each other. So, John Jones, would you tell us your name?
My name is Ivan Blazer.
My name is John Jones.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And who are you? You don't know who you are.
Yeah, nowhere to go.
Yeah, I'm Carolyn Thompson, and we'll continue on, Ivan.
Okay. So here we have Jesus saying, who is the one who's going to betray you? In verse 26, Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, "Do quickly what you're going to do." Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him.
Let me tell you how my Bible reads it.
Sure.
Then you can
No,
continue on. Okay. So he dipped the bread and gave it to Judas, and Satan entered into him. And this is quotes. "What you were about to do, do quickly," Jesus told him.
I like that.
But
what you're about to do, putting that first.
Hurry up. Yeah. Go ahead now, Ivan.
Okay, now with verse 28. Now no one at the table knew why it said this. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, "Buy what we need for the festival," or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. Mm-hmm. Not it was nighttime, but it was night. That's striking, and it means more than just, as I say, nighttime.
We've been reading all this about day and night and night and day, haven't we, John?
That's right. I'm going to try to understand why Judas did this. And I know he thought that if he betrayed Jesus and says, it's the one that I'm going to kiss. He's the one you want to take. He thought Jesus would deliver himself and set up his kingdom.
He had Jesus confused with Peter. Peter took his sword and tried.
He did. He cut off his ear.
The
servant's ear.
He wasn't very good with the sword, and the servant ducked, and he only got his ear.
But what I'm saying is, Judas thought he was going to force the issue.
Yeah.
And then when it happened and they grabbed Jesus and so forth, Judas in the background is saying, he is an innocent man. He's hollering this out. Don't do this. He's an innocent man. And they paid no attention to him. So he is so distraught, he went out and hung himself. Well,
he tried to force God's hand.
That's right. That's what I'm saying.
He tried to precipitate the kingdom, ultimately.
That's right.
And it's always a temptation to do that.
All help along here.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Judas was not the last. Those of us who whose religious movement was hatched and birthed in the time of disappointment, are still subject to the same temptation to try to manipulate the time, to force God's hand, to precipitate the kingdom.
Well, if you don't mind me mentioning it again, when Peter has heard the great confession, and then Jesus tells how, he's going to die and so on. Well, far be it from you, for you to suffer. And Jesus says something that sort of coheres with what it says about Judas here. He says to Peter, no less, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Get thee behind me. You're trying to do something you don't know where I'm going, what I need to do, and so on.
It's hard enough for me to do this. Don't start sympathizing with me and say, "Why, you can't do that." And I think Jesus was very human in his response and saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Because it was hard enough for Jesus to decide to do this. He knew what was going to happen to him. And the weight of the world was on his shoulders.
Well, no one wanted a suffering Messiah.
No.
And in Judaism, the Messiah is not one who suffers.
Yeah.
We Christians, we're so used to that we think probably the Jews thought that too, but they didn't.
They didn't.
It's just the opposite of what they would have thought. A suffering Messiah was not the Messiah.
Yeah.
It just is a contradiction in terms. This phrase that's in 1 Corinthians, Christ crucified, Paul uses it, Christ crucified. That just can't be.
Yeah.
That's absolutely a contradictory statement.
In fact, we got past a very sharp moment of this back in the previous chapter. Chapter 12, if you want to quickly check back into verse 34. Here is where the people raise that very objection, Ivan. Our law teaches us that the Messiah goes on.
Exactly.
I mean, he'll live forever.
Exactly.
Yeah? What do you mean by saying, what son of man is... They're asking, what kind of a Messiah is this? It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit.
Well, they heard the lifting up, apparently as a crucifixion, but they didn't hear the deeper Johannine meaning of the lifting up, glorification, exaltation.
Right.
Yeah.
Carolyn, before we go on,
That's all right.
I think we should notice something about this chapter. We've been talking about what's in the chapter, which is obviously what we do, but we ought to notice what's not in this chapter.
Yes.
Isn't it interesting that we have here the foot washing?
Yes.
And we have the betrayal by Judas. We know from Paul and Matthew and Mark and Luke that it's this night when Judas betrays him, when he institutes the Lord's Supper and takes the bread and takes the wine and says, this is my body and so forth. We don't have that at all in this chapter. Even though 4 other places tell us that this is the night when Judas betrayed him, that we have the institution of the Lord's Supper, we read here, and there's nothing about the institution of the Lord's Supper.
But we have a replacement for it.
That's
This foot washing business, as we were saying before, goes beyond normal just foot washing, and it points to the fact that Jesus is the servant, the one who serves, and it points toward the coming passion. He's going to give himself in death. As he now gives them service, he's going to serve the world.
Doesn't he say somewhere, "Do this in remembrance of me"?
Well, that's in the
Not in
text that John was just citing, just
it's
there.
not in John.
Not in John.
No, that's not in John.
Not
This
in
is the
John.
replacement for it.
But
But-
John, you want to pick up on where you're going with that? Go ahead.
Well, there is a chapter that we've already studied
Yes.
quite a while ago
Yeah, John
that
6.
I think points to the Lord's Supper, and that's John 6.
Yeah.
Because in that chapter, where Jesus feeds the 5,000 with the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and then talks about how he is the bread of life, and that those who eat his flesh and drink his blood have eternal life. It's interesting that also is Passover, mentioned at Passover time. And at the end of that chapter, he mentions the betrayal by Judas, and he mentions eating his flesh and drinking his blood. So I think in John 6, John presents Jesus as the bread of life and the meaning of what the Lord's Supper is all about. And so he doesn't need to present it here again. He's already shown us its meaning in John 6.
Well, something that goes along with that, you do not find any story of the transfiguration in John, where the disciples go with Jesus on a mountain and then they see his glory. But just like, you know, you don't have that story, you have something before. In the first chapter of John, and the Word became flesh, and we beheld his glory. As it were, the whole Gospel of John is kind of a transfiguration. Through John, we see who Jesus really is. You know, so John is really deep in these ways.
I think, John, what really gives this away is that Jesus gave them nothing to drink in that miracle. He gave
That's
them,
right.
He gave them bread, and dried fish. But then the interpretation is, whoever eats my bread, eats the bread, drinks my blood. So clearly where the drink comes in is precisely in reference and parallel to the Lord's Supper, it seems to me. Now what about the fish? Well, you know what? Jesus gives his disciples fish at that last Supper.
That's right.
His breakfast, really, isn't it, at the end of the Gospel? But when you go into the catacombs under Rome, the catacomb of St. Priscilla, indeed, this is in several places in the catacombs where early Christians gathered to worship underground. Small little chapels, frescoes on the wall, wet plaster, color worked in, showing Christians in worship, in prayer, in Lord's Supper, on the table, bread, wine, fish, all three. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, indeed.
It is interesting. Well, I tell you what, we're never going to get out of the book of John because every little bit we have to stop it. So we have an explanation or a double meaning.
But notice, we're in chapter 13.
No.
So we've gone 13 chapters.
When did we get there?
How did they do it?
Okay. All right. Jesus predicts Peter's denial. Is that where we are?
About 31
Okay.
or so.
Verse 31, yeah.
When he was gone, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going you cannot come. A new command I give you, love one another, as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Now, that is so sad. See, here's Peter again. "Lord, I'll lay down my life for you. Lord, tell me, let me do this. You're not going to wash my feet. Well, then, okay, well, then wash my hands and my face too." So he's kind of impetuous, would you say? He kind of gets himself in trouble a lot because he's trying so hard to do the right thing, and he loves Jesus with all his heart. And when he says, "I would lay down my life for you," he means it. But then he doesn't realize the thing is that before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times.
Right.
Well, and this happens as we read on. But Peter, he never will forget that. I think in heaven he will still remember, how could I have done this?
But remember, too, at the end of the Gospel, Jesus and Peter are together, and Jesus asks him 3 times, you know?
Oh, that's right. 3 times. Feed my sheep.
Do you love me? Do
Yeah.
you love me? Yeah, you denied me.
Yeah.
Do you love
Do you
me?
love me?
And he says he does, and so feed my sheep, feed my lambs, and so on. Carol, I'm very struck, of course, by, I think it's a clarion call to all of us and to what we're about in this world, verse 34 and 35.
Chapter 12,
Yeah,
verse 34?
well, 13. "I give you a new commandment, that you
Love.
love one another." not just love one another, but again, just as I have loved you, which is not an easy commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. What kind of love is that he shows, and we're asked to pass that on? Well, anyway, he says, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another.
Yeah.
Sometimes we ask, and we are asked, what is the Adventist message all about?
Mm-hmm.
And our name says we're Seventh-day and Adventist, so creation and recreation. But right in the center of all that has got to be this love that Jesus talks about. That should be, I think, the basic characteristic of Adventism. Now, I'm reminded at that point of, if you don't mind me referring to it, Christ's Object Lessons, page 415, we all know this. It is the darkness, this is like a call to us now. It is the darkness of the misapprehension of God that is enshrouding our world. Men have lost the knowledge of his character. It has been misunderstood and misinterpreted. At this time, a message is to go forward, illuminating its power and saving in its influence. His character is to be made known. Then at the bottom of the page, it says, the last rays of merciful light that will be given to this world will be the revelation of his character of love. That statement, which I am very moved by, I think we all are, coheres exactly with this statement of Jesus here. By this, verse 31, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. There's our call, to love with the same kind of love that Jesus loved us with. That's what the message is about.
Well, sometimes have you noticed if you're in a situation and the name of Jesus comes up or God, they will acknowledge it, whether you're with a neighbor or even another church member, but they don't want to talk about it. And I read somewhere this last few days, it's evidently Satan himself that does this to people so that they don't want to get involved or discuss it. And because I don't understand that, but people will say, well, I mentioned to a friend of mine, we were at a luncheon, and I said, that Jesus is coming back soon. What do you think about all of this that's going on in the Middle East? And he's coming back and all this. And she says, I don't want to talk about it. She said, I've been disappointed too many times.
Yeah.
Now, this is an Adventist, a church-going person. I was totally shocked.
Yeah, you've heard it many times. I will never forget one of the dear saints among us who's now gone, and that's Malcolm Maxwell.
Mm-hmm.
And Malcolm Maxwell got Lou Gehrig's disease.
Yes.
And I saw him coming to this house up at where Pacific Union College is.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us were meeting with the religion department. Malcolm had a hard time already walking because of the disease. He had a walker and he's going along, trying to get going here. And then he had to get up on a step. But he got into the house, and he was sitting in a chair, and he was talking to us. You would never think anything was wrong with him.
That's right.
He was joyous. He was tremendous. And I said, Malcolm, how can you act like this, given the experience that you're now having? And he kind of just boomed it out with the big voice that he had. He says, because we have hope. He said, we have hope. That's what you're talking about. We have hope. Now, we have been disappointed. I mean, Christians have been waiting for Jesus to come for 2,000 years. But I think we have to say, we still have hope. And, if he already came once and he rose from the dead, and if he's up on high, then we can believe that he's coming back again.
Yes.
His resurrection gives us the basis for that,
There are two mistakes I think we can make, and they end up being two sides of the same coin in a way. One is, of course, to lose hope and give up on the hope. The other is to try to think that somehow we have this under our control and can either make it come faster or predict when it's going to come. And I think that is what actually discourages many people and makes them lose hope. I remember one year we kept count that we had 8 different people come in and talk to the pastoral staff, one of us or another, over the course of a year, who had figured out the date when Jesus was going to come.
Oh my.
They were all
My.
different, 8 different dates, but they all had their reasons why they had figured it all out, and some of them were very adamant that if we didn't preach this to our congregation, we were simply showing a horrible lack of responsibility to let our people know this truth. Well, when that happens over and over again, by the way, all 8 of those dates have now passed. So when people do that, they build up a sense of urgency, but that kind of sense of urgency that's built up over those crying wolf kinds of predictions lead to disappointment and to discouragement and to people losing hope. And so I think on the one hand, we have to avoid the false expectations. On the other hand, it would be terrible to sit back and say, the Lord delays his coming, who cares? It's a matter of keeping hope alive, but keeping it alive with what Jesus told us in mind, that we don't know. It's not for us to figure it out. It's
But
for us to
listen.
be witnesses.
He's given us all sorts of signs to help us know. And a lot of those signs people have used over and over and over again till nobody wants to talk about it. But there again, I see the enemy of us all saying, you don't want to talk about that anymore. You've talked enough. He didn't show up. We don't know when he's coming. Forget it. Don't talk about it. So you see, he can kind of put you over the other way. But I do believe we have the signs that are so interesting that it makes you stop and think, well, what's going on in the world? There's so many things happening all at once, all over the ring of fire.
Yeah. Well,
So
Jesus gave us those signs. Mark 13, Matthew 24. He gave us the signs, and right alongside them, in the same chapters, he gave us the warning not to
Right.
get too stirred up about them. He repeatedly says, look out, watch out, be
watch
alert.
out. That's right.
Those are not only look out for the signs, watch out for the signs, they are watch out that you don't get all sensational and distracted by them.
I don't agree with you there.
I agree with
I
me.
think, I know you do, but as your friend, I can disagree with you because that watch and watch out, that day come upon you unawares.
Oh, sure.
See, that's what I'm
Sure,
talking
sure, sure.
about.
Go back to Matthew and list all of the lookouts and the watchouts and stay awake and be
In
on
the
guard
book of Revelation,
in Matthew 24, as I was saying, and list which are in which column, and you'll find there's some on each. Make the column down the middle of the page. There's a good little exercise for our viewers. Let me invite you all to do that. Yeah.
And may I just say, since we bring this up, I think Matthew 24 is a wonderful chapter, and we should be studying that all the time, and it has the watch statements and so on. But Matthew 25
Yep.
has a series, even at the end of Matthew 24 and goes into 25, is a series of parables that take us away from just looking at signs to what we should be doing during the interim between the now and when he comes. We want him to come so badly that we want to fulfill his will for us, such as, all nations gather before him, and there's the sheep and the goats and so on. And what I want of you is that you show mercy, because when you do, you're showing it to me. Those parables tell us the attitude we need to have in this time. One of expectation, but still of service.
And
That's-
of longer time than you thought.
Yeah.
The story of the bridesmaids in Matthew
Yeah.
25 is precisely a story not only of behold the bridegroom cometh, let's all get excited, but rather be prepared for a longer wait than you thought.
That's right.
We in the early days of Adventism missed that message in that parable.
Well, and in Matthew's day, when this gospel was written, Jesus hadn't come back yet,
That's right.
and they were,
Yeah.
that was a message for them as well. Yeah.
But here we are. Look how they love one another. I think that was certainly one of the great marks of the early church. Among unbelievers, they marveled at how the Christians loved and supported and cared for one another.
Yeah.
Hebrews tells us of the way in which you believers went to those who were in prison for their faith. You openly went to prison to help them, bring them lunch, care for them. You openly experienced the plundering of your goods in your household in the name of Christ out of solidarity with one another. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
All right, so nobody thinks like I do that we're living in tumultuous times.
Oh, we are.
Oh,
You're
No,
right.
you're putting me down. The
absolutely.
whole bunch
No,
of yes,
no.
you did. Now let me finish. Let me finish. I'm just saying that there's some things going on in the world that we need to take
You're
notice
right.
of.
You're absolutely
But
right.
you all quoted Matthew 23
Well,
or 4,
no,
and then you said this and that, and we only have 50 minutes, so we can't keep going.
Yeah. No, we didn't put you down. I think
50 seconds.
It's holding two things together.
Yeah.
That expectation to which you pointed, in tumultuous times, don't we all, everyone at this table is looking forward to Jesus coming and hoping he comes right now. But at the same time, we still have a job to do. And it's
When
those
we
two
get to
things
heaven,
together.
I'm going to remind all of you what you said.
That's a deal.
And what,
That I will
what
do
did you
that.
hear us saying is what I want to know.
Anyway, this has been a good 30 minutes, 27 minutes, and now it's almost over. And so, folks, don't give up. Keep looking for Jesus to come. Watch for the signs. And now this is Carolyn Thompson for Searching for Answers.